It's Gaudi's Casa Batlo.
We are live.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dushyant Dashar, faculty at the School of Environment and Architecture, and I welcome you all to the ongoing 4-day thesis symposium. We are going to start the 11th panel titled Bodies in Space with the 3 works. The first one being towards cellularization by Bindya Waghela, choreography between body and space by Aparajita Bhaumik, shared personals, manifestation of the personal into the shared by Raksha Srivastava. We have two respondents today for this panel. Prasad Kanulkar, Assistant Professor of Geography at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati, and Kush Patel, Associate Professor of Architecture and Humanities at Avni Institute of Design. So we will go through the presentations first and then go on for the discussion. So I would invite Bindya to start. Yeah, Bindya, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you. Yeah, so screen is visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dushyant. And my name is Bindya, and my thesis topic is towards cellularization. Having stayed in a joint family, I have experienced both the opportunities and obstacles of staying in a shared environment, between the realm of discipline and rules to many merrymaking and joyful events. As there are many people who believe that the function of a home is to enrich, stabilize, and nurture a person, but there are many people who claims of its failure and how it cripples. So this thesis aims at making a fresh start and looking at the home as an embryonic unit and analyze the regularity of a home's process, because it is this regularity which needs more focus and attention. And hence my hypothesis is the fundamental desire of expression, which is the most innate quality or characteristics of humans, is when made limited or restricted in a shared environment of a home, a person tends to cellularize or nucleate within oneself and then expand the experience of expression through creating microcosms around oneself to feel complete, which has an effect on the aesthetics of mind and space. Followed by my research question as how this cellularization affects human and spatial aesthetics. So the methodology used for the study is to spatially map the microcosm of people. Microcosm in this research should be understood as a micro personal space that is created by an individual in the domain of a household in order to express one's inner desire for physical and mental comfort. The tracings of such spaces is what I call a microcosm here, which can be both real and a virtual at the same time. And the samples chosen for the study includes people staying in joint household, solo occupants, and people staying on streets. So the samples are chosen are on the basis to understand how an individual behaves according to the nature of space and people. So the concept which I am using is cellularization, which is derived from the word cell, meaning singular, a small room, or smallest unit of living things, and the process itself defined as separation into distinct cells, especially from a multinucleate cell. Using the similar concept to understand how an individual, who are the basic units of these larger communities, when in families grow in an uncomfort environment of a home, or the dilemma between nostalgia and resistance, which often leads to first societies breaking into large communities, to joint families, to nuclear families, then to singlehood within the families. This process This process of singlehood within the families is what I refer to as cellularization here, which gets reflected in the society through the physical built form like nuclear houses, solo living, etc., which are often these BHKs or apartment system in cities, which are often portrayed with a certain image of a home in these commercial advertisements, which gets consumed on a large scale. As these BHKs and apartment system, which houses these families, which are comprising of these individuals, often have an imagination of a homogeneous family, where every member is expected to be similar, which is not how families function and stay. And hence this built form doesn't take care of the needs of an individual, which is the basic unit of this larger community, which often leads to the social tensions. And the idea of built form is to be understood greatly because it is this place from where an individual builds the aesthetics and learns to define for oneself and others with which one practices in the respective field of work, and hence the cycle keeps on continuing and building. So, to understand the idea of home as suggested by the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, where he suggests how humans have an idea of self and non self as a basic division of a psychic space. Similarly, a house and non house are the basic division of a geographic space, and how each of them has an interior meant for the invited or the closed peoples, and the exterior or the facade meant for outsiders or public, and how this interior, which gets the form through an individual self or a personal bubble, which he or she carries all the time, and gets its expression through the little claims, arrangements, decorations, or furnitures, etc., in a house. Hence, a home is the most closest representation of a self after body and clothing, because it is this fabric on which one pours out his inner desire or individuality. And since in a shared space of home, where an individual is not alone but with people, there are this innumerable little clashes in the ways of expressions due to difference in the experiences of people, which leads to the formation of invisible walls, boundaries, or marked spaces. For example, how a simple handkerchief saves a seat in a train or a bus, or certain body postures like folded hands, newspaper up, or spreaded legs read differently. Similarly, a smoke from cigarette creates an invisible wall of morals and ethics, which can further be extended to ideas like language, words, or even the ideas, which, if it doesn't resonate with others, we tend to create an invisible wall. And therefore, a home is not just a physical dwelling of four walls, but a collection of expression which expresses itself through objects, furniture, family members, body postures, talks in the house, habits of member, which creates an environment of a home or space of comfort, which is a never-ending process. And when these process of expressions faces rules and regulations of who will set the table or who will clean the dishes after dinner or how to talk, what to talk, etc., creates a limited and restrictive nature of house as opposed to the idea of home as an expressive fabric as we saw earlier. And since the concept of home is very sublime in its nature and often difficult to pinpoint on every characteristics of it due to multiple aspects controlling it, the fieldwork tries to understand the various forms of limitations that can be physical, psychological, or both, and its consecutive forms of negotiations. So first is 63M joint household, where I'm mapping his daily habits or this particular habit of putting the shirt into the door handle or or keeping his personal belongings like chashma box, medicines, wallet in the mandir of the house, and occupying his daily corner of the drawing room besides the mandir, which creates an association of smell like dhoop, agarbatti with a person and a trigger point for the members of the house. The nostalgia of his favorite movies and songs, sitting on the ancestral divan bed and narrating the related stories to the grandchildren. And as the sole user of the gold takya in the house, it establishes ways of comfort and identity. The favorite window in the house, which has plants and large openings where he likes to sit as others goes to work or are occupied in their respective works. The evening walk with the friends or at daily during dinner time, how he keeps calling people as he repeatedly says how he likes everyone's to eat together. Next is 22M joint household, where he stays with 12 members in the house and the person due to COVID has to negotiate for the switchboard due to work from home, and how other members too similarly has work from home. Due to this, which the person has to make temporary shiftings in the house along with his personal belongings, and how he makes his home near the switchboards. Next is 45F joint household, where the female spends most of her time in the kitchen and her microcosm centers around on her feeding her family and family of three kids, husband, and in-laws, and how she works and manages in between two of her favorite activities to do, that is to watch television and embroidering and stitching, and how she gets criticism from in-laws, which creates stress at home and often leads to the discussion of having another house. Second category is solo occupant, where this female 23F solo occupant uses words like more freedom, privacy due to absence of other people, One is able to exercise her control on the house, which is not otherwise. One can be however one wants to be. With staying comes responsibility and more mood swings like hunger decreases. The entire house revolves around one's mood, and there is no interference from other people. Second is 53M solo occupant, who likes to be called as a solo occupant due to the way of living, as the ground floor of the house is totally occupied by the father, first floor by the mother, and the upper floor by respective by son and daughter, and which creates a formation of zone. Third is 35M solo occupant, who also says that one can do any preferred activity, no interference from anyone. Sometimes can be boring. There is a lot of silence, which is good to practice any hobby, and it has a lot of thinking time. The third category is street home. So first is 48M street home, for whom the idea of home, due to the temporal nature, is in the form of floating microcosm, where each member has a thali of their own in which personal items are kept, and the ground is kept for sleeping and eating. And how the idea of home just changes with the step difference, as there is a wider road onto the right, whereas onto the left, their home begins. Next is 15F street home, for whom the idea of home is just not limited to the physical boundary of the house, but most of the time spent outside and around. Like the bed on the footpath where she studies or eats with her brother, or the auto rickshaw parked out where she sits with her friends in the afternoon, or the tree beside which she dries her washed clothes, or the entire street lane where she roams around. Also, to conclude the study and answer the question of how the cellularization affects human and spatial aesthetics, it begins by a distinct sense of difference between sense and space and body, or the idea of self and non-self, which creates an identity for oneself through which one sees the world, and thus building the emotions, aesthetic choice, hobbies with that identity, and always trying to rationalize that identity to various forms of expression, and which when doesn't happen, it leads to various invisible barriers affecting human relationships, friendships, idea of kinship, which gets manifested into the physical world through architectural expression of walls, rooms, fences, boundary, etc., which can further be discussed and extended to ideas like families, homes, communities, caste, state, countries, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Bindya. Can I invite Aparajita? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dushan.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Aparajita Bhomik, and my thesis is choreography between body and space. So, as a dancer, I have always felt and experienced different performing spaces and also performing in front of different types of audiences. I've always felt a space that gets created by the body movements while performing and the way it reflects the space within a story or the imagination of the dance act. So, my aim for the thesis is to explore and develop the knowledge of dance and its language so that the performance of the body can be explored for the purpose of creating a sense of space. The objective of this thesis is to establish a relationship between performance of the human body and the sense of a space, and establish and compile or document the structural principle involved in dance practices that creates a sense of space. My research question is, how does a human body create an auratic space around it, and what is the nature of the auratic space? How structures from the discipline of dance shape spatial thinking? To think about space created for and by the body as the common linkage between dance and space, I utilized the dance performances as a vehicle of dance investigation by employing spatial concepts as perceived in dance to inform the design of architectural space. A dance performance has a few basic elements that help the dancer in creating the space. the movement and the motion that involves movement of the body and the motion of the body on the stage. These can be a combination of rhythm, synchronization, coordination, sharpness, and energy. The expressions are through facial movements and mudras. The props and the background that determines the form of the dance. The geometry, which includes the lines, points, angles, the volumes or the three-dimensional space, the planes or the two-dimensional space that are created by the body. These geometries are used to create symmetry. The timing is all about order, difference, and the light on the right movement in the right step. The memory, which is the imagination, is all about the allegory and the dance form. The reaction and to the audience depends upon the volume, the age, and the state of mind of the audience. So I started reading about how much space does the body require to make any action or to know what are the body extents and how the geometry can be used as a medium to generate the visual and sensory experience in the space. Also, how does the hand movements and the body posture creates the auratic space during the time of performance? Thus, my study revolves around the different Indian dance forms and theoretically differentiating them using the concept of geometry. Rasa, or the taste, gives the essence to the auratic space and gives a sentimental value to the act and creates an impact on the audience. The Natya Shastra, which is the basis of most of the Indian dance forms, include nine rasa, which are the erotic, the comic, the pathetic, the furious, the heroic, the terrible, the odious, the marvelous, and the tranquil. So these are the few snaps from a Bharatanatyam performance showing different bhava, which are the expressions. By tracing the hand movements and the mudras can guide us in analyzing the geometry that the body is making in process of dancing. So for my study, I started taking screenshots of three dance form performances, one from each Kathak, Bharatanatyam, and Odissi, having performed on the same story or the same song that was Tandav Strotam. In these, I have tried to map the auratic space in three layers. That is the body posture, um, one second. Yeah, body posture, the body extends, and the space that is formed between the limbs and the overlapping the forms to get the sense of the aura. Also, I tried to roughly map the dance on the stage by carefully observing the movements. So this one is performed by Shivani Badgi. Similarly, I did for Bharatanatyam, which was performed by Ishani Krishnan. And this one is Odissi, which is performed by Namrata Mehta. But these screenshots were not helping me in tracing the aura precisely. So as the frames were getting too rigid and taken from one camera angle, making us look at only one dimensionality of the performance. So I started experimenting with some of few steps of Kathak that I had performed earlier. For this experiment, I shot the performance from two different angles to observe and map the dance from a different dimension. These are the frames with intervals of 2 to 3 seconds. So here one can see the trace of the footwork for the parts of the performance. In order to capture the movement of the feet on the 2D plane of the floor, I used paint on paper to ink my feet and capture them on a white canvas placed on the floor while performing. The left one is the tihai, that is the basic tapping of the feet, and the right is the toda or the heel swirls. This one is of Choti Aman, which has more movement. And this is Ghatnikas, which has more swirls, more movements. Further, I started overlapping these frames and started to observe the formation of the auratic space. I also mapped the postures and overlapped them to understand its extents and the space that is created. This is Choti Ahmed. Further, I started mapping out of the tangential extents of the performing body and overlapping them to understand the geometry of the auratic space. Further, I also mapped the hand and the feet movements and then overlapping them to understand the geometry. These are mapping from the front view, and these are from the side angle to get the sense of the 3D dimensionality. And this shows the 2D and the 3D plot of the wrist and ankle movements for the whole performance. So in the process, I was also studying about the performance spaces of these dance forms and also learning about the different types of environments and stages that accounts for the essence of the erratic space. Traditionally, Bharatanatyam and Odissi is the temple dance, and Kathak was mostly performed in the darbars. Still today, there are performances that happen traditionally, but the evolution of these dances have changed the perspective of the audience and also the scale of the audience. One might not have many live audience, but recording these and putting on media platforms have attracted many more audiences. Today, these dances are no more restricted to its traditional stage in the temple or in the theatre. I myself have been experimenting with dancing in various different spaces like gardens, beaches, and studios, and of course, there is the stage in the theatre. Audience perspective becomes very important as the performer needs to bring the audience on the same page of understanding. Also, the performer's auratic space needs to interact with the aura of the audience to communicate the emotions and essence of it, whether it's on the stage or street or the camera where you have countless audience. So the study of dance and architecture can go on getting deeper and deeper. But for now, I'm experimenting according to my experiences I had, I can conclude that the exploration has led me to affirm that the body needs to be the focus of a spatial design, referring to the dance in order to give attention to how the body, along with the senses, experience space can lead to the creation of space that will greatly enhance the spatial awareness and overall experience. Each dance form follows a math and geometry while following the tals or the bowl, and that defines the auratic space. The various diagrams and concepts of the of sequences, rhythm, zones, and paths, experiences, and forms derived from the analysis of dances can be explored further to create these dynamic spaces. From the studies and experiment, it is also noticed that dance, being a special form of movement, gives the auratic space its emotions, meaning, spatial experience, and significance of the act or the katha that is conveyed to the audience. The study of aura of the dancer helps us in articulating and designing the space for the dancer and the audience to have the same emotions and experiences. The aura of the dancer becomes the decisive factor on how the audience is positioned and in relation to the performer. It has been observed that the stage or any performance space, when left without movement, is essentially perceived by the audience in two dimensions. It is the movement and the aura of the dancer that reveals the presence of the third dimension. The architecture of the performance spaces focus the visuality of the audience. The particular visuality of the performance space affects the artistic effects of the choreography. I'm not curious about the ideal theater space or the ideal dance studio space. I'm interested in creating spaces to suit the dancing body and all the other bodies around it. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparijita. Raksha, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Roshan. Is it visible?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so hello everyone, I'm Raksha and I'll be presenting my thesis topic titled as Shared Personals, Manifestation of the Personal into the Shared. Concern: how does one find and produce their personal spaces in a shared environment? How do these partialities change with the overlappings? Aim: this thesis aims to open out the concepts of shared space and personal space, and what happens when both these concepts blend together. Unpacking these concepts shall help in developing an understanding necessary for design of any space where shared personal spaces may be actively engaged with. in its dynamically diverging form. Objective is to establish the relationship between the shared and the personal. And thus, the research question is that how does the idea of personal space manifest within shared spaces? The trigger: from growing up in a bungalow, having owned individual rooms, to living in a shared apartment in Mumbai with 4 other people. It was altogether a different experience to having shared the space. Gradually, I realized that there couldn't be a fixed space for everyone, but rather the space keeps reproducing by the overlappings and the dynamic shifts in the ongoing activities. The key concepts that are catered to are personal, shared, territoriality, and claim. What spatiality gets produced when personal spaces collide with the shared space? It is not about how one or self individually produce the space. Rather, it is about how the collective self reproduce the space, thus blurring both. The claiming of space is rather done through networks of neighbors, which makes the claimed space into a shared space. This happens because of the production of common. Thus, space is produced by sharing, and the personal becomes a part of the shared. Coming on to the methodology, this thesis will present 3 cases of a single typology of a shared space that are market spaces in the city of Kanpur. The reason behind taking a similar type is to intensely research the repeating and at the same time diversifying conditions found on the site. The framework will be divided into 2 sections, the macro narrative and the micro narratives. A larger narrative would be built first, followed by the smaller narratives, which would be stitched from the larger context. Section 1, which is the micro narrative, will have the overall narrative, and micro narrative, which will have 2 to 3 individual stories from each site. The section 2, macro narrative, will start with an analysis drawing of the overall site, followed by the 2 sets of drawings named as individual rooms. The diagram on the right-hand side is the base diagram that is used in the second section of the fieldwork. It has 4 aspects to it on which it is built up, namely the occupied space, the claimed or the ilaka zone, the movement patterns, and the sound levels. Coming on to the fieldwork, this is the first site, Naveen Market. The space is laid out in a way that it has a central wide open space which includes the seating spaces. Adjacent to this are the semi-open narrow corridors and then the individual shops. So this is the overall drawing for it, which establishes the sense of the space where each individual produces their own space. Coming on to the narratives, this is the first narrative. It is of the staff members that are working in the market. The drawing talks about how the person occupies different spaces throughout the day. Focusing on an individual here, the occupied space for him remains his body and the stool that he is sitting on. The claim that equates through the movement patterns, which sometimes go to his shop or sometimes towards the people sitting in front of him. The claim that equates through sound levels in order to attract customers to his shop. Thus, the claimed space covers a larger area than the occupied space, which is developed by the layering of these different geographies, namely the occupied, the claimed, the movement, and the sound. These are other narratives of the same site. The second section starts with the analysis drawing that analyzes how each individual is producing the given space. This is the drawing for exploring the invisible rooms. This drawing diagrammatizes all the geographies together in order to stitch the larger context. This is the drawing thus achieved for the same. Coming on to the next site, this is Sisamau Bazaar. It has a wide street that runs along the length with commercial developments on the ground floor and residential blocks on the upper levels. The road branches out to the left side and opens up to the internal narrow lanes that again have individual shops on the ground level. So this is the overall drawing for it. Coming on to the narratives, this is the first narrative. It is again of the staff members. Focusing on an individual here, the person who is sitting at the edge of the footpath, that person develops a sense of claim through not just physical factors, but also through the intangible perimeters like the vision. Thus, the occupied space for him remains the chair he is sitting on, but the claimed space extends towards the front. There is also a sense of temporal in the territoriality. Taking the case of the person sitting on the bike in the front, it is not his own belonging or his own bike, but is claimed by him for a particular time period. This is the other narrative for the same site, followed by the drawings for the invisible room. The drawing thus achieved. Coming on to the third site, this is Bamba Road, a wide street that runs along with shops and other stalls on either side on the ground level, with residential blocks on the upper levels. So this is the overall narrative for it. Coming on to the narratives, this is the first narrative. It is of the sellers that occupy the ground. Focusing on an individual here, the occupied space for him increases as the ground allows him to spill out and not remain consolidated because of the fact of no need to produce sound in order to get identified. The claiming through sound is not evident enough in this case. The claimed space for him extends towards the backside of a stall, where a shared pocket is created, which allows multiple people to use it as a storage space. This is the other narrative for the same site. Exploring the invisible rooms and the drawing thus achieved. Coming on to the last chapter in fences, through the study of 3 market spaces in Kanpur that are similar and distinct in their own way, one is able to understand shades in which large open spaces are divided off a common space through distinct methods of personalization. These are aspects which produce cumulative spatiality of the marketplaces. A comparison table is made in order to understand the repeating and at the same time diversifying patterns found in these sites. It is made on the basis of the following 7 points: existing nature of the streets and shops, the type of goods found, the activity, the people and the setup, the infrastructures occupied, the forms of claim, and the sound levels. The 3 sets of achieved drawings for invisible rooms are also compared. The invisible rooms that form around the body, whose boundaries do not exist within the space, but are rather produced through the overlappings, blurrings, and the combined nature of individual bodies. These web-like spaces are like influenced zones, where the influence is sometimes more and sometimes less. Thus, the idea of personal space for an individual is not a fixed boundary. Rather, its nature is more of dynamic and shape-shifting. It is also concluded that all these domains do not work in isolation, but rather form a loop of networks in their functioning that results into overlappings and blurring of the personal into the shared. This diagram thus establishes the loop in the multiplicity of personals. For example, the claimed space can be affected by the movement patterns, which in turn can be affected by the occupied space of the person. So the next set of individual conclusions are also made upon the 4 geographies of claim that have been analyzed through the field research. The second set of conclusion is made on the reversal of the idea of form as an affordance. So this thesis inverts the idea of the space being affordable to the body. It thus argues that the body or the energetic self itself pushes the environment to make it affordable. It is the elasticity of the body that creates appropriation in the space around. The energetic self is more than just the physical body. It encompasses the mind, the desire, the dream, and the experience of self. Coming on to the architectural use, the way in which these shared or public spaces are imagined for individuals in the current realm do not speculate on the ways in which they are personalized, whereas these personalized ways of individual of individuals are directly connected to the architecture of the space. Therefore, this thesis will help in suggesting ways in which designing can be more personalized and can have the ability to adapt to the personal ways in which the spaces are claimed. At the same time, this will help in opening out diverse forms of imagination of public spaces in the domain of a market space. Yes, thank you, I'm done.
Thank you, Raksha, and thank you all of you. I think the three works kind of discuss the range from the physicality of the body in space to the visceral embodiment of different spatialities. I think the idea of one's own body as a home to or rather looking at the idea of the whole body recomposing itself, with different either individually, collectively, kind of form their own domains within it. And I think rather the malleability between the instinctive and the choreographed body, form a body form actually that creates different spatialities or aesthetic or social interface. I think those are quite interesting points from all the projects to sort of take over. So can I invite Kush to respond first?
I was wondering if Prasad would like to go because I was the first to respond first last time. Yeah.
All right, okay. Prasad? You're on mute, Prasad.
No, I'm still trying to kind of comprehend all the three projects. So there's one work, at least for for Aparajita and for Raksha. There's this study of Chicago by this guy called Dhanveer Singh Brar, who studies actually this particular kind of dance work called footwork that has evolved in Chicago, and that actually might help. And the article is called Architecture. So there's a particular kind of collective life that evolves around the dance form of footwork, which is called the tech life. And this guy is trying to study the architecture of this tech life. So that actually might be an interesting article just to read. Okay, so all three are about the body, and what actually I was kind of missing was relationships to other things, right? Like dance, be it Bharatnatyam, Odissi, or any other kind of dance form is sort of responding to a rhythm, right? Like music to space, right? It's also trying to sort of, in some ways, dance form is an imitation of the world, right? It's a response to something, right? Now, the thing is that you're trying to capture the movement of the dance, right? And trying to sort of get a sense of what you called, and this is something that I would want to actually know more, what you mean by auratic space. So that you're trying to capture the movement of the body through both, like the physical body sort of move, right? What I would be more interested to is how does it relate to the rhythm of the music, right? How does it relate to the space that is there? Because you sort of have documented it, the body in some sense in isolation, right, from everything else, and trying to sort of figure out, what kind of space gets generated. But space is as much about the relationships, right? Not just the self, but to other things outside of it also. So, be it even just music, like, I suggested that article called on this footwork dances because, it has an interesting format, is that there'll be a DJ who plays music, and it's a competition between groups, and it's largely people moving back and forth just with their foot at a very high pace. And it's a way of sort of responding to what is going on in society, right? Like things get thrown at you and you have to sort of respond, and the dance becomes a way of responding to the music, but also to the world at large, right? To living in a ghetto, which is what they are living in. So it's the dance is not simply it is a movement of a body, but in reaction to what is going on in the world or in a society, right? So what is this dance form responding to is something that I was interested in, because it's an interesting, actually what I liked about it was the way you're actually mapping the body movement, like that's an interesting but it has to also have a rhythm, right? Like the dance is so much about the rhythm which changes with time. So how does the body constantly react to something, right, in dance? What is it trying to respond to? Like, what is its rhythm, right? What kind of then space opens up when you're reacting to music, right? It's not simply as if it's an enclosed, cellularized individual in some sense, right? It's not as if something is inside. Dance is in some ways responding to an audience or something, right? So what is it responding to? And I feel like that will allow you to open up the idea of space a little more, right? At this point, it seems very kind of cellularized in some sense, right? But it was an interesting, it's an interesting study, right? It's an interesting study of the body movement and hands and gestures. But you're always gesturing towards something, right? A gesture is not, you're not gesturing to yourself, you're gesturing towards something, you're gesturing, for someone, right? So what is these relationships, right? And it might be interesting to start placing those movements in relationships to think, right? Right now they seem like an isolation and this empty sort of space, right? And which is also what I found in Raksha's thing, is that you have these invisible rooms, right? Again, it's an interesting study, and I find the methods quite similar, that there's these sonic sounds, the movements, occupied space, claimed space, and a sort of and then based on this, so you sort of zoom out and then zoom into an individual, and then again zoom out to sort of look at what overlapping spaces evolve, right? Now, one is, if you look at dance, which is a certain rhythm, right? It kind of keeps moving with time so it's again responding to things, right? So the individual person is not necessarily again cellularized, but responding to movement of other people, right? The shopkeeper is not just shouting out of nowhere; he's responding to people, right? So when you at this moment, I felt like the study is studying each of them in isolation and then starting to overlap, almost like a mathematical set, right? You have these sets and you sort of figure out where the two sets overlap and what kind of an overlapping space evolves, and that is what you call the common shared space, right? But these shared spaces sort of shrink and expand, right, in response to things, right? So there's a certain fluidity and a certain constant movement to the element of the space, right? So the shared space sometimes might contract based on frictions. It might expand based on, right, a police guy showing up, the space might sort of shrink and disappear also, and then might also appear, right? So how does this rhythm of space, like, if you're almost looking at it in terms of a dance, how does this shrinking and expanding of space happen, right? And again, in relationship to others, right? And when I say relationships, it's, when you're saying that it's something is claimed, right? Claims are sort of shrinking and expanding. So how does it, in relationships, say to the law, in relationship to, other shopkeepers, in relationship also to, there is a power dynamics between the small shopkeeper and the large shopkeeper, the food vendor, right? So how do these spaces sort of expand? So when you start, bringing in relationships into these expanding spaces, it allows you a very different kind of a spatial diagram, right? Okay, so and which kind of brings me to Bindya's. I was wondering, I was actually kind of looking at the drawings, and there's an interesting choice of drawings which I'm trying to also understand. Is that certain drawings are like, the house of the solo son living in that bungalow. You have a section which is like, you actually sort of show the whole house, right? But while or the solo person living on the street, you sort of show the whole street, right? But then there are other, like the solo female, you just zoom into the couch or a bed, right? And I was wondering because the cellularization in the other two are always in relationship to the street, or the son is always in the relationship to the father, and but as against this solo female who just seems sort of isolated from everything that is outside, house almost becomes like a bubble, right? And it sort of, I was also thinking, you use the term cellularization, right? But cells also, merge and duplicate, and sort of, there's a process of mitosis that happens that way. They sort of multiply, and, so it's like they're not necessarily existing in isolation in some ways, right? So they also interact. That although the house becomes cellular, but there's also some interaction between the houses or between the individuals and something that is outside, right? So I was trying to get a sense of what you're referring to as cellularization, which I wasn't clear in some sense. So if you can explain on that. And I was wondering, because you were trying to think about the term, as if the house is almost like a microcosm, is what you sort of call it, right? And of the larger societal relationships. Is that what you were suggesting? So I'm still trying to, I'm trying to actually get a sense of the project. I'm a little confused about the project, and I'm trying to get a sense of it. But what I actually found more, a useful way of thinking about it was, if there's a possibility of actually thinking about it in terms of that, each of the case study gives you a sense of, like, although they're cellularized, right? But more than cellularized, there's sense of what is called a monad, in the sense that it's an image of the larger world, right? But it doesn't necessarily exactly sort of get reduced to it, in the sense of that it tells you something about the society, right? And which is where you kind of relate the cell to the larger society, right? The individual to the larger. So how does the space of the cell, what does it tell you about the larger society and the relationships to the larger society? But they're also not, the individual's life cannot be reduced to the larger society. There's something else also going on. And I'm sounding vague because I'm trying to kind of make sense of the project. So it's more of a, if you can actually suggest the way you're going with it, it might actually help. Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Kush, you would want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks Prasad for starting us off, and thank you to all three of you, Bindya, Aparijita, and Raksha. It was interesting to see projects that move us from the very hustle and bustle of the environments in which we live, whether it's the home or a public dance performance space, or even a marketplace, and then you bring us to the very sort of the micro grain of what it means to inhabit that space with your body. So I appreciated that that from the largeness, you're kind of distilling and really drawing our attention to the body and different meanings of the body. So the body is a body in its singular entity. In Bindya's case, a body is a body in terms of its movement and spectatorship. In Aparijita's case, and a body is a body in terms of its choreography within a marketplace, which is deeply overlapping and intersectional. So I appreciated that consistency and the focus with which each one of you was able to do your research. And I also agree with Prasad that, but then I was thinking that, but now what? Because a body is a body in relation to something, right? So once you have kind of distilled and done this very thorough abstraction of the body in terms of space and its use and its production, in what ways is it then helping you think about the role of space in architecture back to bringing it back to the question for architectural design? And so, for example, in Raksha's case, I loved your drawings, Raksha. The sort of, these activity grains that we call them in urban design. I think you were able to really provide a kind of a three-dimensional understanding of that activity grain, and then layer by layer kind of locate how they take place within a marketplace, actually 3 marketplaces in Kanpur. And you mentioned that these were cumulative spatialities, right? But I would say they were also continuous spatialities. So it's not just cumulative in the sense that they're happening within a certain rhythm of time, but they're also continuous because one is able to, they're kind of constantly, bubbles which are continuously forming the very spatiality of the marketplace itself. And so the question for you is then, in this continuous cumulative spatiality, which morphs and gets formed through the occupation of the body in relation to what you call, occupied, claimed, movement, and sound, my question is, what are the visible constants? So you talk about invisible, what is the word that you use? Invisible rooms, right? So in these invisible rooms, which are the visible constants? Is a question that I have. And visible constants and their interaction with these invisible rooms as a way to allow one to then understand how groups of people assemble. So this is moving us towards the architecture of it, right? Then the project is allowing you to then understand how groups of people assemble and also help us challenge our own assumptions about the very design and infrastructure of how groups of people assemble. So if that is the conclusion to your research, which would eventually be also a way for you to then have an architectural project, bring it to that conclusion. The cumulativeness, the continuities of it, the choreographies between what you call invisible rooms, but also visible constants. In what ways is it really illuminating the very act of being together with groups of people? And then when you zoom out, then what is the infrastructure of a marketplace? So that is where it's coming, or at least I'm understanding your project. Aparijita, great sort of method to think about the body. And at one point, then you start centering yourself, right? It was you, right, in those frames, and then you became the very subject of your own research. But here's a question that, as much as you were being very careful and thinking through what is the occupation of the body as it moves in space and occupies space, given the fact that dance is both about space making and spectatorship, in your own research you talk about it as well, how does this research move you back from the deeply personal to the public? And which is to say, what are the multiple ways of being together through dance form? Because then it goes back to what Prasad was also saying, that you're not just dancing in a vacuum or just for yourself. There's the choreography, given the fact that there's an audience. Even if there's an audience of one, which is you, there's a certain kind of a presence of you in relation to other physical space, or you in relation to another body, or you in relation to groups of bodies. And so I think the project, I was thinking that, how do you conclude with these very microscopic, micro understandings, granular understandings of the body and movement, but then begin to address this question of how multiple ways, what are the multiple ways of being together that a research on dance is able to provide you with. So something which only dance is able to provide an answer to is this question of being together in a multiple context. And brings it back to Bindya. So Bindya, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Eight instances, right? You sort of walked us through 8 profiles, starting with somebody who is 63 years old and all the way moving to somebody who's 15 years old. And then how they, the different social structurings of their realities. What was interesting to me is, again, how you were unpacking this notion of self, that even the self is plural, not just by virtue of it being multiple, but plural in terms of their own bodily presence. So I am doing so and so, but my activities in a day are also multiple, which in turn kind of invites different kinds of resistances or appreciations or conflicts or comfort with the people I live, or with the objects I live, or with nobody that I live. So I think that idea of plurality, you were able to sort of provide a kind of a visual understanding too. But then here's the thing, I think there is value in, again, zooming out a little bit and saying that how can space then be measured? So again, we are bringing it back to architecture. How could space then be measured in terms of its claims, or how can body be measured in terms of its claims to space? And then how can space be measured in terms of affect, touch, and even, again, ways of being either with oneself or with being with groups of people? So I think the measurement of space and measurement of body is what would be a useful conclusion as you move towards a kind of an architectural project, which would allow you to then say, okay, what does it mean for me to not just say that a 63-year-old cis male gentleman is able to have these paraphernalias and then kind of move along the day, but then what does it mean to then start measuring space that results from it? And again, measure not in terms of meters or feet and inches, but in terms of these emotions, right? Affect, touch, interpersonal connections, or what have you. And then you have a kind of a perceptual understanding of a space, of a household that develops. And that could be a useful way to enter into this conversation about design. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Prasad and Kush. So any one of you want to respond? Bindya, Aparajita, or Raksha?
Yes, I wanted to respond to one of the things that Prasad mentioned about the shrinkage and expansion of, and how does it happen? What relationships to apply to it? So, I mean, the shrinkage and expansion are based on the people that are occupying the space. So it is not the individual body, and it is the collective self that defines the spatiality of the space. And plus, also, it is based upon what are the type of people that are occupying the space. So in the drawings also, I mean, I didn't mention it, but I mapped 4 different categories of people that were the moving, the ephemeral, the occasional, and the permanent people. So these categories also start defining, for example, in the first case that I presented. So, for example, there's a shopkeeper, a staff member that is occupying a space. It is not his own space. It is a part of the claim space. But for example, when an occasional for example, a mehendi wala comes in and occupies that particular space. So then the spatiality keeps on changing. I mean, so that is a occasional member of the space. That is not his permanent space. So these are the kind of relationships that I try to establish throughout the drawings. The relationship between the occasional, and the permanent, the moving, or the ephemeral. So, yeah.
I would like to respond to the question of the zoom in and zoom out of the drawing. And yes, I do agree that there were a lot of zoom in and zoom out of the drawings, because since I already said that the idea of home is very ephemeral in its nature, it's very amorphous, which was very difficult for me to trace that idea of home. And because the idea of home has structure in time and space, and it is meant for the people who is present in that time, it also has a moral and aesthetic dimension to it. So, which kept on changing for different people, and there the idea of identity then comes, like what are you identified, and through that attached identity, you make those aesthetic choices or the hobbies or whatever expressions you form. So when those expressions you want to express in the home, in the field of a home, but due to someone else aesthetic choice of not liking or disliking, you tend to limit that form of expression. And through that limitation of expression, you create microcosm to feel complete, because you're not able to express in that field of home, because you're not staying alone, but yeah, you're staying with other people. So there are these little clashes of expressions due to difference in experiences, and due to difference in the identifying things. And to answer the question, so yeah, from there the idea of microcosm emerges, like how people in the form of limitations then create another world for them to feel that mental and physical comfort, because they are not being able to put that expressions in some other field. So yeah.
Yeah, I was asked like what is the auratic space. So actually, auratic space is basically the reduction of the geometry which is getting created while dancing, and the movements of the body, which can communicate and the essence of the communicate the essence of the story, and also or a story within the space. Um, yeah, yeah.
One of the things that I was asking all three of you is that whether the space is embryonic or auratic or invisible, all three of your projects are drawing attention to how space is also deeply relational, or bodies are deeply relational. So again, I think the relationality is what is getting kind of diluted towards the end. You start with the cell and you return to the cell, but the relationality which gets measured or could possibly be measured as a way to provide a new imagination or a metric for architectural design is where the potential, I feel, lies. What are the new metrics of design, which are not your when you start, we start, we don't necessarily start with an area statement per se, but we start with a kind of this relational logic, which then becomes a kind of a modifier of space, or modifier of the kinds of programmatic. I think that's another thing. I think program. I couldn't help but think about Shumi's very classic, right, space event and program. I mean, one or two of your notations were very much reminiscent of that logic as well. That even for Shumi, a space is nothing without an event and a program. And so that relational logic, unless you're able to choreograph them together, it doesn't move us in the direction of possibility with this understanding of the body.
Yeah, Prasad.
No, I mean, it's kind of an interesting panel, also just given the time of, the pandemic, where the self has, in many ways, I mean, all the three projects kind of were interesting just because, when you sort of cut off, although, you have technologies and stuff, you sort of have had to rely on yourself a lot, right, in the last few months. and I think that, I mean, Bindya's project kind of reminded me of my students. So, although I'm sort of just teaching online, half of them are depressed because they're living with their families, right? And so you see them like, they're not working, but they're always tired because it's just the idea of, being in a house with the same set of people and same, and it is in some sense, I wasn't able to actually, it was sort of an helplessness in the sense of you don't really know what to do with it. Uh, you can't really ask them to come to the campus. How do you, what are the kind of tools or mechanisms that they can rely on to, and so her work in some sense was reminding me of those moments where actually, or even Raksha's project markets are in India particularly because where the system of infrastructure is so minimal, almost the body becomes in some sense the infrastructure, right? Which is also what you're mapping, right? Where, the sound and the chair and the stool, sort of the scale of the infrastructure is almost sort of reduced to the body. Right? But the moment of the self is also, you sort of start thinking about yourself also because you can't relate to someone, right? So it's important to, like, Kush is saying that you sort of map, the space of the self, but also then have to, you can't exist in isolation, although it's a moment to think about isolation. But the isolation is always in the relationship to other people, right? So in each of the case, I felt like in Bindya's, if you can actually detail out in each of the cases, right? What is this, Kush is saying, what is this space of the self that is being created, right? In these different instances, be in a joint family, by, living by yourself, living on a street. So what are these different senses of the spatial self that is actually, because, and how do you map it, right? Is it simply the plug space and, trying to sort of increase the height of the chair, or, putting a gadda, or how do you, I mean, it's an interesting investigation, which, how do you map, because in the last panel also we're talking, how our homes can also be troubling spaces, right? And that is something that has become very apparent in the pandemic, because both in terms of domestic violence, because family, but also because families aren't necessarily always supportive systems, right? So how do you produce a sense of a spatial self in a house where you want to become a cellular atomized person, right? Does not necessarily always relate to the market always, right? But also, like, a joint family provides a very different kind of a situation. And what is it that you rely on, right? What is the architecture of it in some ways? What is is it the body movement? Like, how do you give it an architectural language, right? Not just the moment of waiting near a plug, but what is the architecture of the body movement? It is an interesting investigation. It requires a little more of digging into something that you probably aren't necessarily. I don't think we necessarily have the tools for it yet, because it is a very specific kind of a situation, right? Like, how do you understand the architecture of the self in a time when you're isolated in a house in a joint family, right? uh, like, what kind of an architectural language do you evolve to study it? How do you sort of sense it? It might require a little more self, if that is the situation in which you are, a little more self interrogation of how do you, like, dig deeper. Now, in that sense, I felt like the dance actually provides an answer to it, because the dance has a movement, right? She's able to sort of map it, right? And if you're thinking about that sort of body movement also in terms of isolation, a movement of isolation through the house in a joint family, or living by yourself, how do you kind of map that system, right? So I mean, these are interesting investigations, and I think the moment is in some sense right to actually kind of ask these questions, because so far, last year when I was here, but also like largely, when I was in architecture, we were always talking about publicness and, shared spaces and, relationships and common spaces. And it's sort of an interesting shift, because now suddenly we're starting to talk about the self and the isolated self within a shared space, right? So how do we start asking those kinds of questions? And it is something that has always been there. It's just that something that has emerged now because we are sort of being forced to think about it, right?
Yeah. Rupali wanted to.
No, I just wanted to say that I think, I mean, one thing that the panel kind of, very importantly kind of brings to us is what I think Aparajita said, that in the first sentence of her conclusions, where she said, affirming the primacy of the body, and in some ways, and we've been listening to this for some time now, like a lot of the presentations that came in before this. But also kind of thinking of, like what you're saying, how do we move from here if we kind of look at the primacy of the body and not think of, the idea of some of the tropes through which we have understood space so far. So how do we actually kind of move from the idea of the mind to the body, and what does it mean to think of space from there, right? So I think, and I just kind of, there's this book that is written by Sandra Reeve. It's called 9 Ways of Seeing a Body. And in some ways, it kind of also encompasses many of the 3 different positions that each of these have taken, because she talks about the body as object, body as subject, the phenomenological body, the somatic body, the contextual body, the environmental body, and the ecological body, And so it's kind of looking at what does it mean to kind of think of body in various contexts. And I'm just kind of looking at these 3 and almost sort of thinking of, whether Raksha's kind of becomes the ecological body, where you start looking at what does it mean to kind of, in this, have these kind of micro negotiations in a public space. How do you kind of think of the public space through these negotiations rather than the contained kind of idea of the public space? So in that sense, how do we kind of look at, or for example, the phenomenological body, Gaston Bachelard has sort of spoken about this idea of fingertip memory, right? That it's not the mind that thinks, but the body that kind of thinks. So how do we kind of start looking at shifting our focus back on the body to think of space through? And I think a lot of these presentations have kind of brought that in, but it's important to sort of push that further and start thinking of what does it then mean for us to think of space from this displaced, perspective. So, yeah.
I also wanted to add a layer onto what I think Rupali you just mentioned, and also I think Kush in his comment about the measurement of the body. I think also how does it reconfigure form? Now I would want to add the layer of form over here, because I think the Prasad's comment on reading body as form, say in Aparajita's work, where the individual body is the form that one is experiencing, or maybe influencing the space around, or the geometry itself is the form that one perceives. And in case of Raksha, where the collective becomes a certain form, where Prasad argued that the body itself is the infrastructure. So the physicality of the body and the mental preoccupations, or maybe where your mind is, or what shapes the form, what shapes the idea of form for that inhabitation, or what shapes say a collective activity of dance. Like for example, say comparing Garba to, they say the Garba is a collective sort of a dance form with to say Raksha's rooms of invisible rooms. I think I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to think through this idea of form.
and I mean, uh, I mean, thing that comes to mind is like a, I mean, there is work on, the idea of the gendered body in the sense of what is, like the fluid boundaries, like, uh, the sense that we've always thought of body as kind of a contained, right, which is there in how we also draw human beings, right. It's always like there's a bound, like as if it's a line, right. While the human body is sort of always, it grows, and particularly when it comes to women, like the fluid boundaries. So there's this book, I think it's called Leaky Bodies, right, where the sense of space for a man is very different from a sense of space for women, just in relationship what the body is, right, because men's bodies are sort of contained in some sense, and while women's bodies are expanding and sort of leaking, and so there is that sense of thinking about the body, but also that bodies aren't necessarily contained, but if one thinks of a body also in sense of as a series of organs, right, that are not that, like, I don't necessarily I can't be contained, like I'm always attaching myself to machines or to something to relate to something, right? Like if my like to get a sense of self, you have to touch the ground, right? Like you don't live in a vacuum in some sense, so you're always in a relationship with things, right? And it also is that it's not like the whole body is there, but like the feet touches and there's a set of reactions that so if it also requires to open up a sense of the body in some ways, and which I think the virus has done to us in some ways, right? We can't think of the body as if it's some contained thing. Today we're also talking about as if disease is something that is like you're fighting, like it's almost a war on disease, but a virus is something that's invisible, it's sort of there and you're living with it. So the body is not something that is contained, but it's also filled with viruses and something that is outside, of other germs. So it's hard to sort of differentiate, right? Like this Donna Haraway's work on the cyborg is sort of interesting because it's, the human body is not a biological body, but it's always also a technological body. It's also always in some sense it has animalistic desires. It's always history and memory in the body. There's movement. You're always on the headphones, and the machine is connected to you now. Your traumas and all of those things are, breathing has become such a big thing, right? Like we're all always on oximeters now trying to figure out how much our breathing is. So you also have a different sense of the body, right? So what does this isolation, like in Bindya's case, what does the sense of isolation tell you about the body itself in some ways, right? Does it, because you're still drawing the body as if it's a contained body, right? Lying on the bed. But what if you start opening out the body itself, what it does in terms of isolation, right? How does it relate to things differently, right? Is it the touch, like Kush was saying, the touch and the feel and the affective sense of the space, has it changed, right? So that might be an interesting inquiry to sort of, open up what we've otherwise just in like architecture drawings just drawn in a very self-contained cell ideas of body. It might be interesting sort of open it up a little.
Exploring the heterogeneity of the body itself. I mean, I think that could be.
I kind of feel like it's more of breaking it down.
Yeah, Shreyank had a comment. Shreyank, you want to come in?
my thoughts are not formulated yet. It's just one thing that came to my mind was that whether it's Aparajita's dance or the kind of experience of the market, or what is interesting is that more and more we speak about the body, and more we think about putting it in language, in some sort of a language, to kind of give structure to that whatever thought, or to that experience. We find it more and more difficult, right? And it's interesting because often what we are saying, and also what we've been discussing in this panel also, is that kind of it seems almost impossible to get at it. It's like to kind of put a finger to it and say this is it, and if body is all those things, it's an extension, technological extension, ecological extension, and other things. That means there might be this kind of false separation of the body and the mind, or the thought and the the self, or whatever you want to call it. In that sense, it's still an unformulated thing in my head, but it's just something that popped up, so I just wanted to share that.
One thing I wanted to sort of add to this conversation is for students, it's interesting that you started with the body and then thought about how the body is occupying space, producing space, right? But I'm wondering if there is a way in which now you could circle back to how the very bodily occupation of space, and through each of the instances, through each of the practices that you have zoomed in on, is producing a certain subject. So I think the production of a subject comes out of this kind of an inquiry. So body, as we are saying, the body ceases to be just a body in the physical, biological sense, but by its occupation of space and the kind of relational logics and continuities and connections that you establish, you're also able to conclude on how a subject is produced. So I think to Bindya, when I hear you, when you feel so frustrated that even in certain kinds of, whether it's multi-family, multi-member, or even singular households, there are all kinds of ways in which we either suppress, you use this term, right? You feel as if your expressions are getting suppressed, and you're able to then kind of either put a plant here or put a little water bottle there as a way to begin to personalize it. So at least you get a sense of self. But then I'm challenging that to say that, but it's through those adjustments that kind of a subject position is created. And this is nothing new. It's a very feminist take, right? That our subject positions are created by virtue of us adjusting in the world relationally. And then the body ceases to be a body in the sense of the physical, but that body becomes political, because then you act on that subject position to transform the world in directions that you wish to transform it. So just wanted to sort of put that on the table as well, that as much as these three projects are an invitation to rethink the measurement of space beyond its anthropometrics, as it is to sort of rethink how bodies are producing subject positions, which in turn can inflect the kinds of programs that we think with architecturally, and accordingly the construction of architecture.
Yeah. Are there any other comments or? Yeah. Okay.
I just had one point about the thing that Kush mentioned. What are the visible constants that you see? So the occupied space and the claim space, the movement patterns, these were the physical factors that can be seen or can be felt. But I'm terming these as invisible in a way because they are not static in nature. They keep on shifting. They are kind of shape shifting or dynamic in nature. So they are not in one position. But these set of lines always keep moving with the body itself. So they cannot be seen, but when a person sets themselves in a shared space, for example, a market space, then these spatialities come to play, or come to play in with respect to the space that is around them. So if the space is like this, so then these boundaries would behave in a certain way. So these set of lines also keep on changing with the space. if you're in a market space, then you'll behave differently. I mean, if you're anywhere else, I mean, in a bus or anywhere, so then these set of lines would kind of change. So yeah. Also, so these visible constants, I mean, I'm not defining them. They are not just a set of lines of the boundaries of the buildings or the road lines or the footpath edges, but they are, you know, a combined form of all these geographies together.
All right. Anyone else who wants to come in? Okay. So if there are no more comments or suggestions, I think we can end the session. Thanks, Aparajita, Bindya, and Raksha, and Prasad and Kush. We meet again at 4:30 for the last session of the day, and see you then. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Steve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashant.